Cool. Morning, everyone. I'm really pleased to be the first person up today. I hope everyone is well. I'm going to be talking today about the history of the control limit. Over the summer, I've just recently got into Bill Bryson books, the audio books. I've been listening to some of his review of science topics, the history of science topics. And when I was asked to do this presentation, I thought, oh, this is my opportunity to be Bill. Not that I can promise you that I am him today, but I'm going to give you a quick tour through the last 50 years. So I'm going to take you back to 1970. And really look at how the control limit evolved to what it is to the present day, and really what caused the changes. Both how things were in the 70s and 80s. And I think one of the things which has been interesting, looking through the HSE sort of archive of old publications that were around, certainly in the 70s and the 80s, was I've tried to sort of feel what it must have been like back then. People were still working with asbestos, making asbestos products, but at the same time, you were getting people starting to get asbestos-related diseases. So back in the 70s, there were sort of 200 people a year dying from mesothelioma. Clearly, that accelerated up to the levels we see today. But I wondered if there's anyone out there that was around in the 70s or the 80s and working with us in asbestos. Please feel free to contribute in the chat box or at the end of this, because I think that would be useful to get an insight which perhaps I haven't had. So what I'm going to do is, rather than sort of cover what I'm going to go over today, I thought I'd summarize it in this slide, which basically is the key milestones, if you like, from the last 50 years. What I'm really looking at is, I suppose, before 1970, people measured asbestos dust, but in terms of gravimetrically, whereas I'm really focusing on, if you like, the phase contrast microscopy era, if you like, so which started in the 1970s. But yeah, in 1970, the asbestos regulations came into force. These basically captured a bit more of industry, which previously the regulations just looked at textile industries, but these new regulations aim to capture construction and other industries where asbestos work was being undertaken. So back in the 70s, there was something called hygiene standards. So these were the precursor to the control limit. Obviously, in mid-1970s, HSE, the Health and Safety at Work Act, came about, and in 1979, the Asbestos Committee, Advisory Committee on Asbestos, published a series of recommendations that really paved the way for the control limit to be in place, and that was actually put into place in 1983 at the start of that year. So there was a limit established for each fibre type, for each of the main fibre types. And then a year later, there was another review, which basically meant that the limits were lowered for amosite and chrysotile. And then we forward to 1987, again, some new regulations came into place, and the 10-minute control limit was introduced. And then to 2006, we moved at the influence of the European directive, and we have the same control limit for all fibre types. So that's really just a quick overview to show you what I'm going to cover this morning. So I thought it might be quite interesting. I'm one of these people that loves sort of trying to visualize what things look like rather than sort of speak them. So I thought it would be quite useful just to sort of show you in a sort of a graphic form how the control limit for each of the main fibre types has sort of changed in the 50 years which we're looking at today. And I must say, when I say chrysotile, I do also mean all the other main fibre types, unless I mention otherwise. So back in the 1970s, as I've already said, we've got the hygiene standard at 2 fibres per mil. And then you can see there was a massive step change in the 80s, so that reduced progressively to about 0.5. Hopefully you can see the figures in the blue circles. That's the actual limit value, and obviously down the bottom of the graph, if you like, the dates. So if we just look at this just in terms of the profile, you can see chrysotile has very much been a stepwise sort of lowering to the present 0.15 mil today. And that's really indicative, I think, of the research about the health effects and also its continued use all the way up until about 1999 when it was prohibited. So we contrast that maybe for amosite. Again, we can see there was a massive reduction from the 1970s to 1983 and 84. And then there was another sort of reduction back in 2006. So not as stepwise, but again, that reflects the use of that mineral in asbestos products. And finally, crucidolite. This one actually, I said earlier about being surprised about history throwing up some interesting things. I actually, rightly or wrongly, was quite surprised that it had been so low since 1970. But then when I looked over all the documentation at the time, it was very much seen as a fibre which was related to mesothelioma. So if you like, a very much clear occupational exposure relationship with this mineral. And back in 1970, the hygiene standard was already set at 0.2. And this was maintained basically all the way through to 2006, and when it got reduced. So we're going to go back to 1970 and look at the publication that was in place for asbestos, the standards at least. And this was something called Technical Data Note number 13. This really was provided for the HM factory inspectors at the time, and it was really to give them guidance about how they should enforce when they looked at asbestos work. And it very much used the standards as thresholds, if you like, to which they would decide whether or not they would enforce. So there was a lot of, and originally, at this time, actually, there was still reference made to the gravimetric limits, but also, as I said earlier, the phase contrast microscopy limits. And also at this time, interestingly, the chrysotile, amosite, and anthophyllite were all lumped together as one. And we'll see later that they began to sort of separate out into the three distinct fibres, or three distinct groups, if you like. But at this time, they were all lumped together. There was a 10-minute standard of 2 fibres per mil. And that was basically a threshold limit, which we wouldn't, HM factory inspectorate would not enforce. And they very much sort of looked at the use of sampling to make decisions on that. And if they saw that the limit, they would use the very short-term sampling to sort of make that decision. And if it was above 12 fibres per mil, they would, before they were going to do anything, they would also do further monitoring to confirm the accuracy of that sample. And presumably if that came out high again, they would then take enforcement action. And that would be along the lines of the regulations, the asbestos regulations 69, as I said earlier, for local exhaust ventilation and the use of personal protective equipment, including RPE. And the extent to which the improvements they required would very much be determined on the extent of how far above those limits or those standards they were. So again, that's slightly different, or very much different from the approach we take today. As I said earlier, the approach for crucidolite was very different. Crucidolite was definitely seen at that time as the fibre that was most potent. And so they basically said that, as I've quoted up there, because the concentration of the mineral that is believed to be liable to dangerous to health is very small indeed. So they really actually knew that at that time. And therefore, they went straight for the controls. So in order to get down to that very low limit, you would have to wear a respirator in order to get down to the 0.2 fibres per mil. So we're moving to the mid-70s, when I was born, but also at the same time, HSE and the Health and Safety Commission were established at the start of 1975. And obviously the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974 was enacted. At this time, the Health and Safety Commission decided to set up an advisory committee on asbestos. And this was basically a group that was tasked with to basically look at asbestos on a number of levels, including asbestos at work. And they basically needed to review all the data about health effects, exposure levels, and anything else that was related, including things like how the public exposure, waste exposure. So it was quite an extensive review that was started back in 1976. But in the interim period, HSC rather, produced the first version of a guidance note called EH10. And that was designed to provide some interim guidance. So this was actually the first of 7 revisions, I think, in the next 25 years. So the first one, 1976. But you can see here, there's very much a change in tact that basically aligns with what basically the Health and Safety the Health and Safety at Work Act says, which is all about this reducing exposure and the terms reasonable practicability. So it says exposure to all forms of asbestos dust should be reduced to the minimum that is reasonably practicable, and occupational exposure to asbestos dust should never exceed the hygiene standards. So the hygiene standards back in the 70s were still in place, but the approach to how they were viewed and how they were enforced on had changed with the dawning of the Health and Safety at Work Act. So in 1979, the Advisory Committee on Asbestos, who I just mentioned, they produced a report. I've got a copy of this report, and it does make fascinating reading if anyone has the opportunity to look at it. It really gives an insight. But this report made 41 recommendations across a number of areas. But in relation to the control limit, or the hygiene standard at the time, they said that the term hygiene standard be replaced because such a concept is misleading in the case of asbestos, as it implies a level of exposure below which exposure is safe. So this is still something, I think, which those of us that are occupational hygienists, we still encounter this sort of feeling that a standard or a limit actually is a threshold. So this basically set this recommendation up. And they called the control limit a new concept, which I thought was quite interesting. But it also introduced the words like realistic level, so again reasonably practicable. And they also said that it should be associated with legislation, and also above which no person should be occupationally exposed. So all these things were in place, as I said earlier, in the EH10 guidance, but this recommendation was now being put forward to change the name and formally change the way that these limits are looked at. So some further recommendations that were made, they recommended that a single control limit for each asbestos type should be applied across to all processes. Interestingly, as I said earlier, at the time, people were still using asbestos fibre, raw asbestos fibre, to manufacture products in the UK. So there was a thought, because you'd get different exposures depending on what you were doing with the asbestos fibre, that there should be specific limits for specific activities. But they considered that, but decided that a single control limit for each asbestos type would be more suitable. you will recall that earlier in the hygiene standards, a lot of them were in place for periods of 10 minutes, as well as a 4-hour one, other than Crucidolite. But they were of the view that all the limits should now be over a 4-hour period. So again, I was quite interested that that actually had actually been put in place since the 70s, and it wasn't something that was more recently in terms of a development. But that was really considered as the most sort of suitable period by which measurements could actually take place. They also said about that personal sampling should just be using the membrane filter method, so the PCM method should be used, so no more gravimetric measuring of dust. And finally, that legislation be prepared to make sure that the overriding requirement is to reduce asbestos exposure to the lowest level or the minimum that is reasonably practicable, which was the terminology used back then. So in 1983, this was basically when the first control limits, as we know them now, were published, and they were published in the guidance note, the second edition of EH10, which I've already mentioned. And basically, the Health and Safety Commission decided to adopt all the recommendations for the control limits made by the advisory committee. So any exposure to Crucidolite, I've put the limits up there, which you've already seen. So 0.25 ml for Crucidolite, 0.5 fibre per mil for Amosite, and all other types of asbestos. It was set at 1 fibre per mil. And the guidance note EH10 says this sort of says they represent the upper limits of permitted exposure where there is still a statutory duty to reduce exposure to a lower level where there's reasonably practicable. So again, we've still got this continuing sort of requirement to reduce exposure below these levels. But back in 83, or it's only, I think it was 1982 actually, because again, sort of looking back in the 80s, there was such a lot of research happening across the world on asbestos exposures and epidemiological studies. And it was a very changing, I guess, sort of environment, or where the research was informing people. So because there was new research or new discoveries happening all the time, HSC asked the advisory committee to have a look at any more papers or published data that might change any of the recommendations or the conclusions which they reached back in 1979. So some of the conclusions they did reach in this report here, they said that the data strengthened the conclusion that Amosite is probably more dangerous than Chrysotile. They also suggested that because of the gross reduction in imports resulting from its replacement in the production of insulation board, that the prohibition of Amosite should be considered. The discussion of the control limit focused on Chrysotile, therefore, because that was seen as the area where potentially there was more room to lower the limit. And they also concluded that an excess mortality from asbestos-related disease of 2% might be associated by a reduction in the limit for Chrysotile. This is from in the range of anywhere between 5 fibres per mil to 0.4 fibres per mil. But they acknowledged that because of the considerable uncertainty, a figure at the lower end of this range might represent a more appropriate control limit. So in 1984, the first edition of the first revision of the control limit took place. So literally within 12 months of the initial ones happening. And these were lowered. So Chrysotile was lowered from 1 fibre per mil to 0.5 fibres per mil. So that's a reduction by a halving of the exposure limit at the time. And Amosite moved from 0.5 fibres per mil to 0.2 fibres per mil. So in 1987, we have the new regulations. So these replaced the 1969 regulations. So again, we've almost got a 20-year period, although there were other specific asbestos regulations that looked at certain activities. This was the biggest sort of wholesale change, I guess, sort of capturing all asbestos work under one set of regulations. Interestingly, these introduced action levels. So these were those levels which looked at continuous exposure over 12 weeks. So that was introduced as part of this 1987. So these weren't control limits, but they were guidance levels for looking at longer period exposure. But what they did introduce was 10-minute control limits. So again, we're almost going back to what we did have back in the 70s, but obviously the 10-minute control limits are very much looking at to prevent very high peak exposures, and also to check that any respiratory protective equipment that's worn is protective when you get these very high concentrations. But they retained the existing 4-hour control limits that had been in place since the early 80s. And now, for the first time, control limits are actually written into regulation, because up until now they had just been in the guidance note, but now they were actually written into the regulation, and that happened in 1987. So 1998, this was another change, and this was really it started because of the anticipated at the time Asbestos Worker Protection Directive. So that's a European directive by which all member states, including the UK, would have to abide by. And they were basically anticipating that the chrysotile limit would be lowered from 0.5 to 0.3 fibres per mil. And at the time, HSE considered proposing a limit that was lower than 0.3 fibres per mil, but decided against that because they're very much sort of trying to balance up the risks of or other safety risks. And in particular, I think this probably relates to people working on asbestos cement roofs, where having to wear a lot of RPE could actually itself lead to accidents. So they decided to stick to 0.3 fibres per mil in line with the European directive. But the 10-minute control limit was also reduced to 0.9 fibres per mil. All other limits remain unchanged at this time. And then in 2006, this basically brings us up to date. The European Union basically recognised that the greater protection was really needed for maintenance workers who are now considered the group most at risk. Those of you that have been involved with asbestos in the last 20 years would have remembered the Hidden Killer campaign, which is very much looking at protecting those that are working on buildings and that could inadvertently disturb asbestos. So they recommended that there would be an introduction of a single exposure limit. It says control limit on the slides. That should actually say a single exposure limit for all types of asbestos at 0.1 fibres per mil as an 8-hour time-weighted average. So HSE implemented this, but we kept the 4-hour time-weighted average in line with current practice, and obviously because it's weighted over a smaller period, it's actually more stringent than the 8-hour time-weighted average. The 10-minute control limit was replaced by a short-term exposure limit. This was originally included in guidance at the time and then put into ACOP when the 2012 regulations came into place. So that brings us up to the present day. Present day control limit, it's applied to all people undertaking work with asbestos. Employees must not ensure that any employee's exposure exceeds it. And as has been said before, exposure must be reduced to as low as level as reasonably practical below that limit. So there's going to be a few presentations today. Rob's going to be talking about the challenges of monitoring against the control limit. And I believe Gary Burdett is also looking at that tomorrow. But this really sort of brings us up to the present day, I guess, the challenges in trying to measure it accurately and representatively. And very much the new HSG 248, which I'll be speaking about after the break today, we've made a few changes but really we've allowed the, in line with the World Health Organization's method, to go up to 2 litres per minute sampling rate. But the greater emphasis really is on representative sampling, and this really is very important because you can do monitoring and you can tick a box, you can get a value, but what does that actually mean? It really means sort of trying to understand what happened in that exposure period. And I said I like visualizing things, so you'll see this is I'm basically plugging everyone else's events here, but you'll see Dan Barracliff in one of the Mythbuster sessions later at the end of tomorrow, I believe. He's going to be looking at how you measure against the control limit. So those of you that are analysts out there, that's definitely worth a look at. But this is one of the slides which I've used from his presentation. But it basically shows you what the control limit looks like. So this is basically someone removing asbestos. It's hypothetical, but you can see there's a few little peaks depending on what they were doing, prizing away AIB wall panels. Then they'll have a break, then they might go in and do some fine cleaning. But that is what the control limit looks like. But you can see it's very, very important to make sure that the time that you do sample is representative. And that's it. Thank you very much for listening. I hope that was useful. And yeah, any questions? I think Kim will organise that just now.
Thank you, Sam. A fantastic way to start the conference with some context, and amazing to see how things have changed over the decades. I know there was lots of chat in the box about people who remembered various stages. Really a lot of praise for the Simpson report, which some people were saying should be referred to more widely. Is that something that you would agree with?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I've literally I got hold of HSE's sort of information archive, and I started reading it, and I was really actually hadn't managed to read a lot of it, but there is some really useful stuff in there, and I think we're often quite guilty, I think, generally all of us, of just sort of being in the present and not really looking back at what work had already been done, what discussions and debates had already been had, and I think it's definitely worth revisiting those. So I definitely will be going back over those and pulling anything out that I think might be useful, for my work going ahead, and sharing them with other people as far as I can, which is really what today was about as well.
Mm-hmm. And is that quite easy for people to find on the HSE website, or did you have to do some digging?
No. I think I can probably let everyone have a copy because they're no longer in publication, but I will have to double check, so I don't want to promise everyone anything. But if I can, I will. I'll find that out, and if I can supply people with the PDFs of those 2 reports in particular, I'll certainly be able to do that. But yeah, I'll just better make sure I'm not breaching any copyright rules or anything. So that would
be great. We'll also share that on the BOHS Twitter and LinkedIn as well if people are looking for a resource there. And obviously you can always contact Sam as well if you want more information on that.
Sure. Yeah.
Sam, thank you. We will speak to you again later on, but for now, thank you. You can turn off your microphone and your camera.